Thanks so much for having me here, for the invitation to speak with you all. When Christine reached out to me, she asked if I could speak about sex and bodies in church, and to weave into it content about my identity as a Jew, as a queer woman, and as a progressive parent. I speak to groups all the time about sex and sexuality. I'm very comfortable doing so, and usually I have some personal stories to share. But to be honest, while the stories are mine, they are more universal in perspective and don't ever relate to me as a Jew, queer, or woman specifically. They absolutely are about progressive parenting, but the other stuff, it's usually absent, since those stories may be perceived as less relevant or less universal. My first response to the invitation was some nervousness. It's a level of professional intimacy that I'm unfamiliar with. Sure, I can talk to just about anyone about sex, but this felt different. My second response was enthusiasm and gratitude. What an incredible opportunity for me to reflect on these parts of myself and share my thoughts with all of you. The fact that it's framed around spiritual revolution is particularly compelling, both professionally and personally. So with that in mind, I have some reflections I'd like to share. To begin, I am not religious. My Jewishness informs pretty much every aspect of my life to one degree or another. Chicken soup runs through these veins. Even standing here is informed by the tradition of storytelling that is an ancient and contemporary part of Judaism. The sermons at my synagogue growing up were largely about telling stories to make sense of yesterday and today. Because my focus as a sex educator is on raising sex-smart kids, my own journey being parented and parenting influences me as an educator. So, it starts with my mom. Karen was a reasonably good sexuality educator to me in the 1970s and 80s. I didn't entirely know it at the time. Don't think she did either. But as I got older, and my understanding of what fits within the umbrella of sexuality, as it became clearer, I see that what she offered was foundational. Oh, phone. That's because it was foundational because sexuality is at its heart about power and agency. Agency being the capacity to exert power. Not everyone in the world has a sense of power and agency, either generally or when it comes to sexuality, but I do. And I am very explicit as an educator in my support of others to experience and honor that power and agency. This power and agency informs other aspects of sexuality that in turn influences and shapes all of us. It influences me as a parent and as an educator. Sexuality is much more than what we do sexually. It's more than our behaviors and our practices. It encompasses sexual orientation, gender identity. It encompasses sensuality, intimacy, and our physical health. With a firm understanding of my power and my agency, I have been able to struggle and understand and embrace my gender, my sexual orientation, and many other parts of myself. My power and my agency allow me to understand that sexuality is about lifelong learning. From all of this, I've come to believe that sexuality is a force of good in the world. Instead of encouraging parents to talk about sex with their kids to keep them safe and free of unwanted consequences, my approach is that we ought to talk to our kids from the start about the wonderful, life-enhancing and enriching and sought-after aspects of sexuality. Of course, young people need to be informed about sexually transmitted infections, sexual assault, homophobia, and gender discrimination. But the starting place, the foundation of it all, ought to be about the trust, respect, justice, and joy that can be pursued through an understanding and expression of sexuality. Among many other things, sexuality is a way of expressing individuality and a way to experience pleasure and joyful connection. This idea that sexuality is good is simple but powerful. As a society, we often are taught that sexuality is something that is required but depraved. It's dirty, secret, shameful. It's more than survival or our need to sustain the species, though. It's about how we treat ourselves and others. Many Jewish attitudes about sex are not as progressive as I would like, but I'm a firm believer in being choosy about what we get to apply to our lives. So I'll share some of the positive lessons that I've learned. For instance, while procreation is a fundamental Jewish religious obligation, it is not the only religiously validated purpose of sex. Jewish tradition recognizes sexual companionship and pleasure as important and good. We are here in part to experience pleasure. Hanne Blank, a queer and Jewish historian and writer, offered her take. She wrote that if you're having sex with someone you love and care for, and you're extremely careful not to hurt yourself or hurt them, either emotionally, physically, spiritually, or in any other way, then it's very probably a-okay with God. So kosher sex, in her mind, can be almost any kind of sex if you are approaching it from a reverent, careful, loving, and non-selfish standpoint. I agree. And as I explained, sexuality is much more than merely physical. There is a Hebrew word, chesed, which I first learned when it was used to describe my Zeta, or my grandfather. There's no absolute translation for it, but the closest we have is loving kindness. Chesed is common for describing God's love of humankind, but it is central to Jewish ethics and is a virtue all on its own. It's about charity, connection, and compassion. It's about grace and benevolence. Chesed is also about justice. And this concept has played a central role in my life and greatly informs how I parent my kids around sexuality and how I teach it otherwise. My job as an educator isn't to tell people what they ought to think or feel about sexuality, but instead my job is to shine a light, a joyful light, and a permissive light on conversations about sex. I've always been an advocate for young people and ensuring that they are offered honest and comprehensive information about sexuality is, for me, a key way to help support them to thrive. I share my values around sex and sexuality, but I always encourage others to articulate and share their own values around sex and sexuality, and I encourage them to do so in ways that build a more trusting, respectful, just, and joyful world. Tikkun olam is a Hebrew word for repairing the earth. It is often used when discussing issues of social policy and safeguarding those who may be at a disadvantage. Many people, where sexuality is concerned, feel a lack of power or agency. That can shift through conversation, education, cultural acceptance, and legislative change. It allows us all to question what we have understood as truth and think about whose truth and at whose expense. Sex education is the way I engage in Tikkun Olam, and it is a central way that I embody chesed, or loving kindness. So to offer a few small sex ed lessons today, I have 9 ideas I'd like to share with you all. 1, build a foundation of sex positivity. That means reframing the conversations we have, the beliefs and values we have, from protecting our kids to preparing our kids. Talk to them about sex in ways that are expansive rather than limiting. 2, be honest, accurate, and forthcoming. Don't wait for them to ask. Some kids are askers, but some aren't. Bring up the subject because it's important and because it's interesting. Read books together that allow for learning for everyone and message that people, if they're lucky, are learning about themselves as sexual beings their whole lives. 3, encourage developmentally appropriate curiosity. There isn't a right age for talking about sex. It's right from the start. It can begin with learning about one's own body, knowing the words for our genitals, and having a clear power over our bodies and how we use them. 4, celebrate bodies, not what they look like, but what they can do for us. Don't shame kids for getting to know their bodies. Where we know ourselves best, we're most able to share them with other people. And when the time is right, that will be incredibly useful and empowering. Our bodies are beautiful, and they are worthy of our time and attention. 5, joy and pleasure can be expressions of resistance and social justice. 25 years ago, dancing in public with the person I loved was activism. Marrying my wife was about asserting rights and responsibilities within a gay relationship. Sharing affection with my partner in front of my children, in front of my parents, in front of my community. Not too long ago, these were acts of resistance. And in many cases, they still are. The need for social justice around sexuality is still very real. Just ask women in places where they can't access birth control or other basic reproductive health care. Just ask gay men and women in the 76 countries with anti-homosexuality laws. Just ask a transgender person looking for a safe place to pee. 6, sex is intimate. I always tell teenagers, even a little bit younger than that when 2 people mash their bodies up against one another, it does involve intimacy. But it doesn't necessarily involve a lot of intimacy. See, intimacy is extraordinarily enhanced through trust, respect, and mutuality. 7, sex and love are distinct, but they go oh so nicely together. 8, communication is key. It is really our job to confront the awkwardness we feel and to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, even in that awkwardness, and talk about sex. When we're able to talk to our own kids about it, even admit that it's difficult and challenging, but that it's so incredibly important, we model and message to them that having those kinds of conversations within their own intimate relationships is going to be a critical way that they have a healthy and vibrant life. Thank you so very much for having me here this morning.